Welcome to the Revelly cast, a cast hosted by Nicholas, also known as Matryoshka Monarchist or Pseudo-Deucalion on X, and Laszlo, also known as Sele or Underground Aeon on X, interpreting the dreams of kings. Today we're joined by Odyssean father, author, podcaster, and survival instructor Andrew Edwards in dialogue about his new book, Abstract Operator, coming out of the highly successful CROWBAR and the previous King of Dogs, all available on canonic.xyz and Amazon. May the holy patriarchs and prophets intercede for us. Welcome. Could you start us off just going through what inspired Abstract Operator and the influences to include CROWBAR, but also beyond that?
Definitely. So Abstract Operator, the frame that we've set it out in is that it's a nonfiction work, like a manual that arises out of a fictional book. And I think that seems, a little precarious or awkward. And it was really sure to get it done. And the truth is that even now, I'm not like 100% sure where it really comes from, but I have figured out the fact that we live in like this state of like excessive uncertainty, where so many of our social systems and our political systems are just constantly, and over many years, like I've experienced this for 2 decades, just a sense of decay. What is that? And yet here we are. We still eat, we still have high technology, but we're in this bizarre period of uncertainty. So in some ways, Abstract Operator started off of that footing. Like, how do you deal with not just a sort of systematic way to deal with uncertainty or change, but something deeper than that? Before we hit record, we were talking about this idea of the deep player, something below even the level that most people presume. And immediately we're into religious territory. That religious aspect, is a big part of Abstract. It's a big part of everything for me and you guys as well. But managing that without going into like pride and heresy and those things and presuming, and I don't ever want to veer into that sort of territory where an author, a guy who runs a podcast is some sort of, I make no claims in that way, and I try and go out of my way actually to make it clear that this isn't me attempting to be prophetic or even deal in theology proper. That said, there's plenty of room in fiction and nonfiction, of course, for the layman to approach these sorts of topics. And to kind of put a bow on it, on the first question, the main way that I managed that wound up being, and this was not really it was kind of by design, but it was also just provisional. And it occurred to me along the way that I could have this nonfiction manual that erupts or arises or is hatched, as I say, out of a fictional world. And maybe by placing it in such a strange or unusual sort of position, that would afford readers some ability to kind of themselves be removed from whatever their standard perspectives are. And they could take a look at the material in almost any way they want. How is that? Does that make, I know for you guys, that's probably not unfamiliar territory or too far out there.
Yeah, I mean, the medium is the message here. It seems that there is so much of the text takes on a musical quality and is also covering musical qualities that let's say string together perception. And it seems that there is a relation between all of the crafts that you participate in that has produced this work and that has produced the perspective that it's speaking about. So yeah, it's kind of Laszlo and I we were talking about this earlier, that there is if you were to there's this question about the chicken and the egg, which came first, and there's a logoic perspective. In the beginning was the word, and you can imagine that the potential, let's say, for the chicken and the egg actually looks something like a cube, and there is a relationship between the chicken and the egg that is paradoxical inherently, but that paradox exists in this potential space that's actualized in creation. And so it sounds like through play you've participated in this paradoxical meta creation where you've kind of reflected enough on your own processes that your final work is about those processes. And that is, I think, in our technological environment, that is the type of perspective and the type of perception that we have to have to navigate.
Yes, it's like a survival. You need that to survive
Yeah.
in sort of this, in a technological environment that can basically hack your reality, right? Or create these elaborate illusions. And, there are examples of this in the book. At a lot of places, right? With this idea of like people being imprisoned in different times, right? So it isn't just like it's a prison is no more so like a physical structure, but people can be imprisoned in different modalities of time, and for example, block time, right, or pure linear time. And that this abstract operator can sort of navigate all of these traps as a survival strategy, but also by doing that plays a game of time in some sense. It's really interesting. This I really love this idea of that the book came from. It's kind of like a fictional manual inside another world. So it's like there's like an alternate world which has this, and then it relates to us. And I think that has a lot of, okay, we'll get into that. But Andrew, I really want to ask you, what is, okay, this is going to sound strange, but like in the world, what is the abstract operator? So like what kind of, let's say, transcendent, or not transcendent, but more like a pattern, what kind of pattern does the abstract operator embody in your sense today?
Well, I view him sort of as, before we got started, we were kind of talking about this generations and this idea of, Generation X in relation to, and sort of skipping a generation and going to Zoomers, having some sort of like affinity or potential together. And, I think that, and we also talked about this idea that the abstract operator and the Orthodox Christian, like we're in this position where we need each other. It's like without all of the parts of the engine, we can't even get started. We can do various little things by ourselves. I feel like the abstract operator is this character that it kind of has maybe maybe his special quality is that he just simply realizes that fact and he almost it's like a peacemaker in the sense that he has to run around and sort of do work to not just for his own benefit and not just for his own particular game, but and we definitely got to talk about the game aspect maybe to flesh it out. But his pattern is sort of like, I think of it as a union or something like that. Maybe not a union because we have all these political associations with that, but maybe something closer to a guild. Of course, we have potential for weird association with guilds too.
Knight, perhaps, like knighthood?
It's absolutely something like that. It's something, maybe to simplify it a little bit, it's something like a guerrilla partisan figure coupled with some sort of functional job in like ontological or metaphysical spaces. But he's definitely not a king, right? He's not vying for anything. It's a service. And it's almost like a service that has to be done, maybe not with a pure heart. We talked as well before we went online about rogues and this sort of figure. This is one of my favorite figures in all of literature and movies. And it's often done wrong, but when it's done right, it seems to have, for us, it has like this redemptive, there's usually an arc of redemption going on of like major loss before that and a sense of getting something done or participating in the project of humanity before time runs out. I think that all those thoughts are available and operative in abstract operator and to some extent maybe in Crowbar as well. So I guess again, to try and simplify it, it's closer to a knight. Yes, I think you're right.
When I was reading Abstract Operator, not only Abstract Operator, but when looking at your work as a whole, I often am reminded of Saint King David because, I read a lot of Ernst Jünger back in the day, and I also came across the Davidic analogy with the Anarch, where King David, like you said, is yes, he's anointed, but there's a period of time where he is he's in that position of not having the legitimacy without usurping King Saul, and so he becomes this exiled anarch type of figure. And you see that in like that Davidic exiled king in Lord of the Rings as well, with Aragorn. And the rituals are very similar. In the virtues are very similar in these two, let's say the king and the exiled king. There's the musical quality, there's the deep authority that is carried by these figures, and a mentorship that is carried by these. I think that Ernst Jünger said something along the lines of, "I am not a man who does not want authority or religion, but a man who needs it." That's something that I see as well in your work, which is, somewhat conspiratorial, somewhat hopeful as well, in spite of the darkness. That conspiratorial aspect, I think, is a revelation of the King Saul type of figure as well. There is an occultism to King Saul. There is a tyranny to King Saul that is conspiratorial. I think that you map that out, and I think that the abstract operator is a man who lives in that world of conspiracy, and yet plays music in the face of it and builds a band in spite of it. And that is another figure that Laszlo and I were talking about, is Gurney Halleck from the Dune books and movies, is this musical marshal character who wants true legitimacy and true authority in the world.
Yeah. I was listening to your guys' first or last episode. Mr. Pajot was talking about exile, and then I caught another little snippet where I think you guys had touched on it, and maybe he wanted to clarify his position, and he just made it real clear that there's this relationship between exile and magic. And in the way this works, oftentimes for me, I kind of feel like I'm groping around in the dark. And I sort of have some wordless intuition towards a thing like that. Whereas Mr. Pajot is just able to kind of make this obvious connection. And I think you just did that yourself. Although we talked about it earlier, this relationship with King David and the music and the ways that, I don't mean to be too dramatic, but I hadn't made that connection until you made it for me. And then when you made it, it almost in a kind of meta way proves my case for this figure of the abstract operator. Insofar as one of the ideas that I'm playing around with and that I think about a fair bit in life is that it's kind of that Philip K. Dick idea where there are these multiple timelines, but there's one event in all of history. I view it as this, and of course, I'm talking about the era of Christ. I view it I abstract it actually into this picture where a meteor hits whatever we think of is time, and these ripples go out from there. And in this way, for me, I solved the problem of, I never viewed it as a problem, but how is the logos there at the beginning, but Christ shows up? All of this stuff is just kind of ridiculous to me. If we make like the proper attributions of what Christ is, we're contingent on that. Our stories are contingent on that. And what Philip K. Dick said essentially was that he felt like he was living somehow, not a false, he does go into kind of Gnosticism, and I'm not trying to do that. But there is some sense where those stories are reverberating maybe through time. And it's not that our lives are meaningless in any sense. It's something much more complicated and elaborate than that, where those stories in some sort of like ever present now, if we say that they're still happening, this is still happening too. And so the abstract operator is constantly orbiting that issue of how would time work if, from our perspective, it seems as if it's linear and this happened in the past. But once again, I think this is all solved in, the Orthodox understanding of what God is. And so I move into concepts like sacred time in order to manage that. And I love Junger. I don't claim to understand everything in the way that he did, but your point about, I remember that exact quote. It's his anarch figure is, what's the other one he says? It's like the anarch is to anarchy as the monarch is to monarchy. This figure
Yes.
needs it. And that's exactly, I thought a lot about Junger, and I thought a lot about the anarch, or the anarch, and also his little book, Forest Passage. Here you have this exile theme as well. And I love the way that you frame this once again, where it's these rituals. It's kind of like just the basic survival sort of activities that we have. We make a fire, we get the family together, we cook the food, we clean our space, we kiss everybody goodnight, we pray. I'll make one point, and then I want to throw it over to you, Laszlo. Before we went live, we talked about, again, I love these conversations because it really helps me put these ideas into maybe a more manageable frame. There's this sense that for me personally, my experience with music is that it's just gotten progressively worse and worse and worse at mainstream pop sorts of levels, and in many ways at the other levels as well. And the whole thing has kind of been shorn of some of its glory from even the 90s. This thought occurred to me long ago, and it's been kind of circulating for many years now, that there may be something particularly special with this ritual of music, that we live in, and we happen to live in a time where part of our job, may be part of even the job of Gen X, may be to sort of pass along a few of the things that were available to us. As one example, and then I'll shut up, is the first concert I ever went to. I didn't have much preparation for it. It was in Portland, 1989, at University of Portland, and it was Primus, the Pixies, and Jane's Addiction. I didn't own any albums from these three bands. Of course, they went on. They're all still very famous. They're not my favorite bands. But that was a profound experience. It was truly dangerous, and it was kind of life-changing, not in the sense like, oh, this was the music I loved, and it was more that I viewed something quasi-religious from an immersive point of view, and then I could go back to my safe space with my mom and dad and kind of reflect on that. And whatever is going on there with like gathering together and making music, or making music with your buddies on the porch, or making it in recordings and whatnot. My intuition is just that there's something more there. So yeah, I will finally shut up and throw it back to you, Laszlo.
Okay, so I have a lot to say. First of all, the Philip K. Dick analogy. In my notes when reading abstract operator, I wrote down PKD's great game. And in a sense, the abstract operator is presented as a sort of, and we talked about this before the show, as a deep player, right? Even where this book came from, it really reminds me of the framework that, as you explained, Philip K. Dick gives, which is this idea where like his fictional worlds were to him very much real. And then those fictions sort of were the ground on which he wrote many things, and he wrote his exegesis, right? Or where most of his thoughts were derived. And I see this parallel between the abstract operator and the gamer as an archetype, which is right now is very much in the mud. It's like a very muddy archetype, but I think there is a way to salvage it. This, in Philip K. Dick's cosmology, God is playing a sort of great game with the devil, but in a sense, he's always winning. So God is always winning. He's making all the winning moves. And what sense I got from the book is that the abstract operator is someone who wants to be the best, or at least that's his instinct is to become the best, let's say, how do you say, like the best figure on the board to be moved in the right direction. So the abstract operator sort of consciously wants to be part of this great game of outcomes in the world, and that is not flattened, but it has like a qualitative part, right? So and you mentioned this in the chapter about power, where the game wants to show itself to be a game, and it's not about power. And that the abstract operator sort of recognizes that. Oh yeah, I got the quote. So the game itself wants to witness the game.
Yeah.
I think that is like witnessing the game within the game is sort of the dimension of synchronicity. And sort of the abstract operator kind of moves around that. And another interesting, just to tie it with the anarch comparison. So if the anarch is sort of like someone who's, let's say, more in a historical setting rather than, let's say, a simulation setting, right? Then the anarch is someone who confronts sort of executive decisions, and he answers to them with the stoicism of a monk, right? But the abstract operator is a bit different in a sense where the abstract operator sort of expands his own sense of aesthetics, taste, and generally the way that the abstract operator perceives sort of flow, I would say, and then expands that to everything, like everything, to the world. And that's how sort of these harmonics, you know, these things that fit together become so intuitive. And I would say, yes, that's the dimension of synchronicities. And that dimension is at the point where the game itself witnesses the game, so to speak. And I think that's a great, so yeah.
If I could play off of that, Laszlo, it seems that from an Orthodox perspective, the highest image of what we're in dialogue about here is the cosmic liturgy, and the liturgy on Earth kind of syncing up with the cosmic liturgy. And the abstract operator is a nomadic liturgical figure.
Yes, that's a great way of putting it.
Whereas the liturgy is sedentary. And that relates again to like this Davidic figure. You can imagine him in the caves still in a state of worship, but having to compress whatever the liturgical life he participated in before was, and not only compress it, but like liturgy, disperse that to his band of his army in the desert. And that's, I think wherever we're headed in America, strategy, nomadic ritual it will be crucial for survival, not only of ourselves, but of the traditions that we participate in.
Definitely. Yeah. Laszlo, did you want to pick up there? I can add if you want, but it sounded like...
No, please. No, please go on.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention or pick up where you mentioned the liturgy. I think you're exactly right. I think he's this nomadic figure. And of course, I didn't have to point it out to you guys. Maybe some readers will benefit from some light thrown on, like you say, what's going to happen with America and the rest of the world. But preserving the tradition might really get dicey and need some figures like this rogue character. I mean, of course, at the beginning, we're told that a lot of liturgy and various of our traditions had to like go underground. I mean, maybe that's where all the political associations come from, was the original idea of taking it underground. But in the case of America, I think it will literally be, and probably Europe for sure, you're going to have to carry that around. You might not be able to make church happen at the same spot every Sunday. You may need to be prepared to do that. And so here enter, I think, if people want to consider abstract operator in a geopolitical or similar lens, there's some commentary that there for sure.
So to me, it's interesting because, there is this problem in churches, or at least this is just a general problem with any kind of worldview that sort of people join in, and of course, because the medium is the same, which is the internet and sort of the cybernetic superstructure, it's like everything has the same issue, which is that action. What do you do? Because like a lot of catechumens come into the church and they're like, okay, so now I have it. I have the true church. I have the theology, the right theology. And then now what? And there is this sense, there is this need of action, this need of movement in the world. And that movement sort of requires I think that is something new, but also something that can be also recovered from the past. I think there are a lot of examples of sort of, and we talked about this with Nicholas, that like there's a lot of saints that we kind of forget have different professions. There are general saints, there are politician saints, there are emperor saints. And so there's a huge roster, huge bundles of action out there. or like what you can do. But still there's this feeling of like of that you can't really engage with that, because the system, or let's say, I don't want to call it the system, but let's say this kind of like this matrix type situation that we're in, which just means that like we are encountering technology that can literally manufacture belief, right? That in that sense, all of those positions are somewhat illusory. And again, you talked about this in the power chapter in Abstract Operator, but at least the sense in that chapter is that I got was that basically all of these statures of power are ultimately illusory, and if you pursue it that way, then you're just gonna get trapped in a type of like in a bad loop, and that's not gonna fulfill anything. However, seemingly the abstract operator is also capable of overcoming that. In some sense, it is the character that can act. And I want to give it to you, Andrew, of what do you think about action in let's say, in this post-historical world?
Yeah, I agree. I really like that. Once again, I think I come back to, or where maybe some of this rises out of is well, tragedy and loss have this, it's stated various ways, but it kind of removes you in the one hand and then also puts you closer to God. And in some way, the way I view the abstract operator isn't that he's like his course is determined or anything. Quite the opposite. It's almost like some sort of figure that can be deployed not away from God, but almost like in the same way that, we're told the disciples are these fishers of men. And I'm not trying to make that direct association, but more, again, sort of a pattern. Like, think that action has this quality of there's a genius to it. And so maybe what that means is like a little bit extra luck, a little bit extra favor. If you take this action in the right spirit and maybe in the right frame, it isn't that this guy alters categories of good and evil or anything like that, but it is something closer to, because his faith is so kind of complete and again, I guess I will say, in the way that I view the stories of the saints, they may give him some capacity to sort of go into darkness and yank things back out of that, though that's dangerous and there are consequences. But we see this even with priests. We have the idea that if we have to call on somebody to wade into some really murky stuff, the priest is our guy, because he has this enhanced relationship with God. And the abstract operator is afforded some of that, just not the same responsibilities, but he has some capacity to take this type of action. So again, to try and make it a little bit simpler for myself, we also have like soldier and martyr figures in the history of the church that are kind of analogous in a way. Like they're taking action and they're literally going to war. I remember, and maybe you guys had this experience too, where I've talked to cradle Orthodox at different points in my life and informed them that there are warrior saints. It was a woman, and I won't name her name, obviously, but she just stared at me like, what? That's not true. And I'm like, well, I'm pretty new to Orthodoxy. I suppose I could be wrong, but why don't you check it out too and let me know? I never heard back from her, but of course this is the case. And so when I think about that, I think about, okay, well, what does that mean? So anyway, Laszlo, you're absolutely right. There's something about action in time and a spiritual dimension, and all of that does sort of, I still wrestle with this all the time, or I wouldn't even think it was worth sharing. Why would this come down to music? What would that have to do with something like defending your faith and your people or territory or tradition? And there's kind of these kind of hippie ideas about like, well, I don't know, it holds people together. And yeah, that's true. But I want to posit, I guess, that there's a larger function happening around the playing of music where these various levels of concern we are given. I view music as one of the best gifts that we have. I wonder, so I postulate, if this isn't this gift where all of these ideas, faith, action, flow, love, in the like multi valent sense where it's patience, it's trust, it's all of these various attributes. What if this is one of these practices where we can kind of engage in that on this level and it resonates through all these other levels? So part of the action is it's again sort of multidimensional. It isn't simply moving, but it's not just also simply sitting around playing music. It's somehow all of those things that the abstract operator is sort of pointing to.
I had this intuition while reading your book, and I've had it before. It's an intuition that can come from uh, many hours on the internet and on social media, that the all of the technologies prior to the present are kind of being, in some sense, they probably began in one place and they will end in one place as an arsenal that is also a set of instruments. There's something happening where the weapon and the instrument are married in the future of technology. And I don't see a way around that. And I think every state, not only our state, but every state is beginning to view all art as armament, let's say.
Yeah.
There's an aspect, you see this just in the history of music, where you have the war chant, you have the and that's crucial. That's crucial for being in a military. And there's something about the angels, bearing trumpets and also bearing weaponry. I think that, and you see this really represented with like the walls of Jericho, the story of the walls of Jericho, Joshua and the walls of Jericho, where the horn becomes a weapon also. And there is a state of liturgical music that disarms you. That completely disarms you. And what that looks like, let's say that the noose is the relationship between the head and the heart. And what that looks like liturgically is the loss of intellectual defense, the loss of the intellectual defenses, which we all have up, especially in modernity and especially in our current information environment. But there is a point during liturgy where the liturgy disarms that. It disarms that, and that is both instrument and weapon. Your defenses are breached and your heart is exposed. And that's I think that's part of what the abstract operator is. He is surgically operating onto himself also. The abstract operator is, because of his nomadic and exiled nature, a man who is also mostly performing operations on himself and waging this war onto himself. And this I think, when this figure comes back out of exile, the fruits of that will be distributed in a way that couldn't have been distributed unless he was in exile and unless he was developing these sensibilities.
I'll just say one thing and then I'll throw it to you, Laszlo. You grabbed the exact thing that I left on the table in that last little bit, was that there's you hear poets and some of the ancient Greeks seem to imply this idea that music and I guess music and war erupt out of the same general source. What that really looks like, we could probably get down to if we want, but at our point, absolutely, they're half the work we have to do is like this cognitive sort of these security operations to determine, am I going in the right way? Should I engage in this material and these sorts of things? So brilliant. I'm glad you brought that out, because I mean, it's critical to, I think, any understanding or trying to engage with this book, but also again, with the point of the liturgy. I think I know the exact point to which you refer, because you can feel it. It's like, all right, yep, I'm good. Whatever that relationship is between the music and the instrument and the weapon. Again, I think you make a great point that for maybe we could even add to it a little bit to say that these operations are on himself. And I hope that in the nomadic, in the exile and the isolation, part of this tension maybe that makes it all work is that he's never actually alone. And it's this, I don't want to say exceptional faith. Who knows how you would measure faith necessarily, but it's more than good enough for him to find his way back home. Always, he's, I guess there's always that chance, but this is a figure that somehow in the exile or the tragedy or the loss, he's going to wind out in this place where the contradictions or the cognitive warfare, which is often so often it's just poisoning the well in some sense. It's mixing these two things so that we get confused about what's what. But, again, I think maybe you were pointing to something as well about the heart, which we might want to go into. I'll pass it back to Laszlo.
Yeah, just to quickly add to the whole discussion of instruments, that the instrument is an eschatological object, right? In a sense, even the Greeks said this, and I would say Christians also say this, which is that the idea of like being instruments toward being instruments of God's or being instrument of God, right? And in that sense, sort of the action, whatever it may be, is equal to an instrument that plays a certain pattern. So in that sense, in this eschatological sense, at the end where all technology becomes instrument, I think what that means in some sense is that all technology becomes something that that transmits pattern. And again, like the abstract operator sees itself as an instrument of pattern. And this relates to this great game, he's a part of. He wants to be an instrument to the great game of God, basically. At least that's my reading, if we sort of throw the games there in some sense. So yeah, it's definitely, it's interesting. What else? Yeah, that's it now. I'll pass it back to you.
Yeah, I mean, there's a place that I think when speaking about the kind of teleology of technology, I do think that that teleology has to be in the form of a man. We talk about, there's a relationship between weapons and instrument. There's a relation between the head and the heart. And what we're pointing at is the remembrance of man, the remembrance of our image. And I think in the negative, in some sense, the Antichrist, I've posted about this before. The Antichrist is nobody. The Antichrist is the, let's say, the furthest you can get from a man, the shadow of a man. And what follows the Antichrist is the filling of that shadow. Once again, it's the difference between the black cube and the gold cube of the New Jerusalem. The abstract operator, he recognizes his lack and his, let's say, the necessity for craft, for metis, but that is a bringing from the outside in. That is a communion with the Logos until within himself there's an incarnation of man. Let's say the man within man. There's a friend of mine who would say it like that. He would say that we have to remember the man within man. And I think that's the end of the operation. I think the end of the operation of the abstract operator is remembering the man within man.
And just to give to the previous one, one last note, is that the center or the foundation stone, which is sort of symbolized or is entangled with the image of the heart. I mean, the heart itself makes rhythm, right? So in a sense, in a very deep sense, it's connected to music. And that the heart as something that basically contains the person's central being that is expressed in all of the things that the person does. That is directly connected with a sort of music. So in a sense, all of our expressions are, the music that the heart produces, that are on the rhythm of the heart. So again, the abstract operator is also very much noetic. I mean, he has to be. He has to sort of, by exploring the world through rhythm and music, he explores the heart at the same time. Yeah, I would even say that like those two things, the world and the heart, are interchangeable for the abstract operator. But I'll throw it back to you.
Yes, brilliant point. Essential to understand or like have a good meditation on this book, I think, is exactly that. And we could mention too, I definitely wanted to mention this fact that this book, part of sometimes you'll hear this thing among writers where they'll say the author has to go through the same process that the hero of the book goes through. On one level, this refers to the hero's journey where you kind of got to get started and then you run into problems and people come and help you. It's tough, and then you come back kind of with an object or a boon, and maybe that's the book. And it's pretty useful idea. But in our case here, some of the helping that came along the way to finish this was from you guys. So it really became this kind of thing where I had to look at it and say, as much of this is, sure, I'm the guy who has to sit down and write it. It was this collaboration at a distance, almost at like telepathic levels. There was a time period when I was writing very hard on it last year, and you guys were like kind of getting your Revelly thing started and posting new perspectives and new associations and combinations. And it was eerie where the synchronicity, was just like so precise that I would take notes and then discuss it with you guys, bounce ideas off of you. And along the way in that, you probably remember it was you who pointed out to me that there's this, maybe you remember better than I, but there's this central like nerve highway, a relationship between the auditory and the heart and the vagal system. And that to me was like, okay, well, I'm not too far off into the weeds here. And I guess it was maybe something you picked up from the WARHORSE, or maybe we were trading notes at that point. But I just wanted to say for the audience that like a big piece of getting this book done was really just relating to you two characters, maybe a few others, but you guys in particular grasped it more in some ways even than I did. So if there's no other record of it, I want to say thank you. Of course, I'll put you in the, in the acknowledgement section of the book when it prints, but I wondered if you've thought about that more. It was also you that made this point to me that Orthodoxy itself, our tradition, is really heavy on the auditory, and a little bit we have different relationship with the visual, which I thought was not just like super profound and fun to think about, but like immediately practical for me as I relate to the world and my icons, or as we said, like our image, the fact of our contingency as being this sort of image, but yet we have this connection at the physical level to the news and somehow maybe to flow and music for sure.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah,
Well, thank you.
That's why we do it, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, I think that what Sele and I try to do in part is, especially on the internet, is treat reality almost in the opposite sense of the Platonic. Like, let's say everything is illusory. Because I think when you frame the world that way, you tend to miss things. But if you treat everything as significant, as real, even the virtual, your intuition, it's not only intuition, the participation that you have with the world is different when you play with the world that way. So insights like the relation between the ear and the heart, some of that came from like a McLuhan-esque playing with the phonetics of heart and kind of the ear being central to that word in and of itself. And then from there expanding out into the examples. In some sense, it's very much a abstract operation. That's part of the process. There is taking, let's say, the institution that is science and natural philosophy, and let's say the empirical process, and testing the limits of that testing the limits. So taking an intuition, which all science is basically testing intuitions, as far as I can tell. Like a hypothesis is really an intuition. You can cite examples, famous examples from Descartes to Newton, where their biggest insights come from these flashes of intuition that they have, that they test. That same process is, I think that same process is not truly revealed in its fullness until you become Orthodox, because with Orthodoxy, the range of intuition increases.
Yeah.
Range, and in some sense, the liturgy is a place in which you work out your intuition, you teach your intuition. And so that's, that's where many of those insights come from. And like you said, you started reflecting on your own icons. In the West, the statuary and the artwork that typically comes out of the West tends towards the photorealistic. And the photorealistic, let's say, is less mysterious than the form, the iconographic form. And when we talk about mystery, what we're often aiming at is the auditory, because the auditory is the domain of the invisible. The eye, you could say, we refer to God as being beyond being. The visual tends towards being. It tends towards, it is what it is, that kind of frame. Whereas the auditory is invisible. You can't perceive it, under natural conditions, let's say. And it draws you in. You're anticipating a mystery always when listening to a piece of music, especially if you're not as familiar with music theory, where within, a few minutes you can kind of intuit kind of what the structure, the total structure is. Something like jazz, takes that further, where it's constantly mysterious. I think that information saturated environment, and you see this even portrayed in a lot of the artistic movements in the West. There's something about the increase of information paired with the lack of liturgical embodied structures to contain it. You see this jazz kind of play itself out visually, and you see kind of the West lose that photorealism, and start to, and that may be part of the process even of the conversion into Orthodoxy in the West. Is the West kind of lost its constriction around the visual, and has been opening itself up more and more to the auditory.
100%. I would agree with every word. I wanted to add that in that liturgical space where it's like paradoxically, maybe in letting go of that attachment to, say, Western realism and measurement and certainty, there's also like a protective layer too that isn't available in something like the random psychedelic excursion, where I think in liturgy, you have this freedom that you don't normally have, but you're also, I hate to say it, but kind of like a fencing, or just, it isn't that it's just the protective hand of God. It might be one way to say it, where it's kind of bouncing you back and keeping you generally in useful spaces, or always in useful spaces, whereas other types of operations really don't do that. Psychedelics is one where I think that people, you could call it sacred time or what have you, but that, and certainly all these options open up and all these associations are there, but that protective and guiding sort of element is, you can find it, I guess, if you want to go deep and dark enough, but it's not there. Generally, in my experience, it's quite the opposite.
Yeah, I mean, you are without the armor of
There you
the without the armor of the scientific instruments, you are thrown into the laboratory of Gödel's incompleteness and Heisenberg's uncertainty, and Leibniz's infinitesimal calculus. Unlike those giants, you don't have the and you're thrown into that. And that may be another part of the Gen X Gen Z relation. Gen X, I think, is they're veterans of that psychedelic time period. And the Zoomers, and there's been some studies on this, the Zoomers tend towards being very extremely sober. And they tend more so in that direction. And so using more stimulants like nicotine, not drinking alcohol. What's another thing? Not really dabbling in psychedelics too much. You see that more and more in Gen Z. And I think what Gen X can provide, oddly enough, because usually the roles are reversed, where the older generation is more sober and more let's say right-handed. Roles are reversed. I think part of what Gen X will have to show the Zoomers is how to play. And I think your body of work is one of the highest forms of that's expressing itself today in the media environment.
Thank you. I couldn't think of a higher compliment than that. And I have to say, I just think that's a brilliant and, I mean, just amazing idea, which also happens to be true, that may be a big part of that relationship between those two generations. Because clearly Gen X, well, I'll just leave it. I mean, if anyone wants to figure out the details on that, they can go do it themselves. But I don't know of anything else what could be truer than that. That's exactly what our experience was, or mine and most everyone I knew, at between, say, age 16 to about probably 30, a good solid couple of decades, where the media saturation, the social scenes. In my day, I lived quite a few different places, and it was uniformly, well, I mean, it did get like less and less, I want to say, like bacchanalian or Saturnalian. It almost got less real on that level and more sort of virtual. We saw it on TV, or we see it in the halftime show or whatever now. Whereas previous to that, my experience was it was available at just a more visceral, constant, all the time level. Every concert or weekend that you would go out was pretty crazy. Whereas now, that you're right, that has just been much more contained and maybe raised up to some odd levels. Anyway, thanks for saying that. I really appreciate it.
Time and time again, this is part of being a Christian. All it takes is a child and a mother in a barn and to change history. And all you need is a family to build an ark, and mankind moves forward. But so if there is a mentorship that can be had between Gen X and Gen Z that bears fruit, then it's definitely worth exploring, I think. And I think that's, I think that is inevitably will express itself in this podcast. Just personally thinking about some of the guests we've had so far, and then some of the guests we have planned.
Yeah, it's I mean, greatly put. I really didn't have anything like big to say there, just like a couple of notes, which is Gen Z is very sober but also very neurotic, right? That's a big thing, which is really interesting, that neuroticism comes from, let's say, an implicit danger of constant surveillance, I think. And this surveillance is, which is very interesting, and this kind of relates to music, I would say, but in kind of like it's in like an evil or dark twist, which is this surveillance is not the surveillance of Big Brother. It's not the surveillance of some control center, like some controlling center. It's more so the surveillance of cinema and storytelling. And so this is why, interestingly, we are the most sober generation. I would say we are the most neurotic ones. But we often refer to words such as vibes, or someone has motion, doesn't have motion. So all of this stuff is interestingly related to this, to the flow state. It's related to the music, to the vibes of like, oh, how someone moves. But where the dark twist is that actually, what it just means is that, like, how cinematically proper are you? Like, are you cinematic, or are you cinematically get quote unquote like destroyed, right? And are your vibes good, or are your vibes off? And then oftentimes that, like, the interesting part is that the surveiller is exactly this, is like, it's a director who's like, okay, is this moment your triumph, or is this the moment of your fall? And then that's like a constant danger. And so sobriety, I would say, is a reaction to trying to control the situation, trying to be in character, so that if you're not sober, that you might do something that might get recorded and then it's forever out there. And I know a lot of people who have a deep sense of neuroticism from this, from just the implicit presence of cameras, where they would like rather not, they would rather not dance. I see this everywhere. Like people don't want to dance at all. And then if you go to, I don't know, a club or something, I don't know, I don't really go to clubs, but like there is like an analogous, I don't know what it's in English, anyways, where like people, dance. You will see that like most people just like stay put and they move very low, and then they look at sideways to other people as if like, as to expect someone to record or someone who watches, right? Being watched, so to speak. And I think, like, ultimately that's the driver behind that sobriety. I think the solution is, again, it's an abstract operator, which is just play the game. Just don't care about that, because ultimately it really doesn't matter. It doesn't matter, but that's a hard jump to make, and it's a pretty dire situation, because it kind of like makes every social situation into a vacuum that's open or public. And then also, but again, also it's very interesting that there is this constant referrals, right, to these things such as vibes. I would say like the idea of like the vibe is such a good concept. I think it's a good concept, but again, it has this dark twist. Like, is this vibe? Does he have the vibe? Is this what kind of vibe? This or that? And aura. There's this, this idea of aura. All of these things are very much, parts of this, of the general image, of the flow state, of the musical state. Yeah, it's interesting that we are kind of like have a narrative surveillance state in some sense. Every misstep can be made into a narrative, which is an interesting thing to be neurotic about, because ideally that kind of living in a narrative is the originator of meaning. But here it's used as a sort of weapon, as an instrument or a weaponry.
Just
Great
to
point.
bounce off that real quick, I've referred to the surveillance state in its baptism, let's say, as being the theater of the martyrs. And I came to this conclusion after seeing the churches being blown up in Gaza, and the effect that had on me in particular was more moving than anything else I had seen. And of course, we're saturated with imagery and videos and these things, but it stood out. It stood out amidst all of the footage that was coming out around that time is coming out. And so, yeah, I think Gen X can, I think, direct Gen Z to pick up the martyrdom, of being exposed, let's say, under the eyes of Saul and continuing to play your harp. It's interesting. In our last podcast, we spoke about the golden statue of Nebuchadnezzar, which is paired with the music that makes you dance, or the music that you are dictated to dance to. And in some sense, we're in kind of an inverted situation where the image of Nebuchadnezzar makes you freeze, makes you immobile, and we're called to, the Christian in particular is called to move and to act, as we've been speaking about in the world.
Yeah, I mean, just one more comment, is that Gen X made all the great games. We often talk about media, and we have to acknowledge that Gen X made all the best games. And now we see how hard it is to make a good game. I feel like at this point, it's probably harder than making a movie.
Half-Life, Metal Gear Solid.
Oh yeah.
Any others to name drop?
I mean, just Valve as a whole, I would
Valve.
say. I mean, that's like one of the best examples. But yeah, just generally, it's Bungie, early Bungie.
Halo.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like there will be, like Gen Z will have to learn from that. We'll have to learn from that creativity there, because there's a reason why they were the ones who made all the good games, and now we see that as they are sort of replaced by millennials, it's actually harder than it seemed.
Yeah.
No, that's also kind of symbolic or synchronistic with the abstract operator in some sense. Being good at making games is probably a really important talent.
Maybe I could just add that, I mean, in trying to boil all those things that you guys just said into one from the Gen X perspective at like experiential, emotional or internal levels. I remember, and I think this is kind of borne out throughout my life and the lives of the guys that I've come of age with, where there is something about this, what Laszlo said, what you said about, in the end, it's just going and playing the game. If anything, maybe because like all our parents were boomers, we know, let's not take the boomer detour right now, but that is a thing that maybe I could say without much more deliberation before I commit it to record is like, we did have to do that. Like we did. And the opportunity was there and kind of we have nostalgia about some of the ways that like we were raised, at least in America. And I imagine there are some parallels for Europeans, but yeah, at some point, and I remember my mom saying this all the time, you just got to get on with it. And I see that sometimes with Gen Z, and I'm referring here obviously to like the neuroticism, which we had that too. And so did the boomers. It isn't like it was all just portioned off to this weird generation. Like it's all there, but the conditions that men and women are having to fight their way through to come to age now, they are oppressive, but I think it was always oppressive, but they're weird enough now that saying something as kind of boomery as like, well, you just got to get on with it may not be all that helpful. So perhaps something like Abstract Operator and what you guys are doing with this podcast and also your work on X. I know that it's odd to say like the work is on X, but I mean, both your guys' feeds are like these brilliantly curated ongoing art exhibits and like philosophical as well. Just getting on with it and playing the game. If the Abstract Operator does have anything, or Gen X maybe even has anything to offer, it's like it. And again, maybe this is just too like boomery, but I'll go back to my statement about like boldness has a genius to it, where maybe it's not a possessive genius, like he's a genius, she's a genius, but just the act of doing it somewhere in there. People say like, well, action provides more information. To me, that's just more systematizing or whatever. It literally just gets your body moving. And as you were saying, like these constrictions on movement and the body. And what I wanted to say was that what the Abstract Operator maybe has is like this, like not a faith in himself, but a faith in the game. And so maybe that's, I don't know how much longer you guys want to go, but I don't know. That might be the place to leave it. Is the whole
Fortune
thing is
favors
like
the bold.
Right. Fortune favors the bold. And this mysterious condition that we're in, mystery, the game is encapsulated in there, and just having faith that it, again, boomers would say, well, it just works out. Well, it kind of does. The game is set up that way. And so having faith in the game, to whatever extent that makes sense to someone, may be all we have. And then from there, like you say, the action, the boldness starts to inform, and it becomes clear, or clearer anyway, that you have to go. Like we can't just perseverate in neuroticism or what have you.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we can't really also like freeze in our choice of oppression, because I think like I said with a lot of people is that they have a lot of opportunity to go out there, but they sort of limit themselves because of some kind of like belief, prison cube that they got from the internet, or from the same place that narrativizes them and surveils them into freezing, and so from that place then they kind of like internalize it, and they freeze themselves over for all kinds of reasons. And I just see that repeating, where seemingly the opposition to the system comes, or in some sense, like all kinds of oppositions sort of want to keep the state of being an underdog in some sense. Like they kind of like want to keep that afloat, just so they can pretend the fight in some sense, just so they don't have to act in a way that is not controlled.
Yeah, you're onto something, I think. I mean, I see the same thing.
Yeah, time prisons, man. This is our technology now. Cybernetics puts people into all kinds of captivity. And sometimes it doesn't look, sometimes it's like, if you view it from a political, economic standpoint, it doesn't look like captivity because it could be very successful. But I mean, a lot of these people, you just look at them and it kind of bleeds through.
Yeah.
The type of act that they have to do, and it's very interesting. Anyways, I give it back to you.
Yeah, I mean, Andrew, if there are any, let's say, final words related to the work, what you would like to see come out of it in the cultural spaces that we participate in, and any final insights you wanted to bring out to kind of shape how it's read or inform how it's read.
Sure. Thank you. I would say there's opportunity for people to read it separate from CROWBAR, but obviously you can read it with CROWBAR. I tried to design it so that it will work both ways. Maybe the best way is to read it first and then go read CROWBAR. But if you've already read CROWBAR, it'll be fine. I think it works both ways. In terms of like final words, I think we said, honestly, we did a fine job. I don't know that anyone else is talking about the relationship between these two generations like we did here today, which seems to me to be a brilliant thing that should be explored a lot more. This idea of, because that's another aspect of just the mentorship or intergenerational relationships that gets crushed, if you will, by the machine. It's very natural. It's very human. I'd kind of leave it with that probably. I would grab the books, let me know what you think. I will say, I guess I'll close with this. Music was such a big deal for me. And then my generation, we saw I guess the whole spectrum of like prior to MTV, the closing of MTV, and then the streaming and the digitalization of the whole thing. My intuition is that there is this profound sort of set of weaponry, instruments, arsenal that's just sitting there. And part of the idea behind this book was I wondered if your generation had noticed that there's this wide open opportunity to go out and play music, whatever you want. It doesn't have to be, which was, again, that was part of my experience as a kid, was you would go to a show and immediately like, this sucks. This is not my thing. And you could leave and go to another one because there were hundreds of options. When I lived in Austin, it was like that. Living in Portland, it was always like that. I know that seems odd as like an act of resistance, and it smacks of a little bit of the hippie, but in practical terms, going back to the Forest Passage and Junger and those sorts of perspectives, I definitely think there's something there. So maybe I would close it with that and say, yeah, thank you for having me. And thanks too for like the collaboration. I can't emphasize enough, for guys and gals who like your stuff, you definitely informed huge portions of this book. So once again, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. It's an honor.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. With that, where can we find your work?
Yeah. Mostly I'm on X. I'm not a huge poster, but all of the links are in the link tree. Right now, as you mentioned at the start, some of the books are on Canonic. I'm working on getting the other ones up there. For the time being, it's Amazon. I do have a deal going right now with the Substack where if you want to choose the annual subscription, I will send you a signed copy of Abstract Operator. I'm hoping to have this out in the next couple of weeks. If the Substack thing is of interest, I don't know. The deal's pretty good. I tried to make it a pretty decent deal. Yeah, that's it. That's where I'm at.
Your final thing, your navigation courses. When can we expect those to return?
So my thinking this year was to get this book out, and then I had to really recover from CROWBAR because it was so much. I'm not trying to be too dramatic, but it was much more successful and big than I thought, and it opened up some other opportunities. So my thinking was I'll kind of buckle down and finish Abstract Operator, do the audiobook for CROWBAR. So we're almost there. And then I'm going to focus on discussing this Navigator course on Substack. I won't put that behind the paywall. And people who are already in will just have a direct line. But what this is a sort of an odd take on a tactical class. I went to many, many tactical classes over the past few decades. I've trained with some of the best. And I wound it into a kind of something I thought was more to, I guess, reality in some ways. Like, it's going to be focused on tracking, and it's going to be focused on endurance and breath work more so than just running guns, as we say, and burning through a bunch of ammo. And I'm not even sure that there will be any ammo at all. I've done versions of this class where there's live fire and not. It's really not necessary. It's not a huge part of it. But that'll be available. We'll have that discussion. You're part of that discussion. Laszlo, you're invited, of course. But
Thank you.
yeah, it'll be very unique. And I think it'll probably go down in all three of those places, like Patreon, Substack, and X.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, Andy, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for all of the work that you've given us. Please, not only Gen X, but all generations, please go out and buy Andrew's work and keep an eye out for that Navigator course.
Yes, thank you guys. Such a privilege to talk to you and collaborate with you again.
Thank you. God bless you, Andrew.
God bless.
God bless you guys.